Good evening, everybody. Here we are again with Professor Henry Binford to hear the second part of his mini course about the emergence of Chicago. In about 45 minutes into his talking, we will take a short break, which I think will be useful to all of us. And we decided to keep all questions to the end. There were so many questions last time that if we start asking questions in halftime, God knows where we will end. So Professor Binford will stop a few minutes before the time that we need to all leave so that there will be time for all these questions. So join me in welcoming again Professor Binford.
Well, thank you once again. I'm happy to be here. I bring you regards from Carl Smith again. He and I have been in touch, and he's improving, not quite 100%. I offered him the chance to come in and do the second half, and he said he'd rather get well. So here I am. And it occurred to me that although the title of this mini course is The Emergence of Modern Chicago, it's not entirely clear what that means. What is modern Chicago? Well, for purposes of this gathering, I'm going to think about modern Chicago as the physical and political and social entity that existed around the time of the First World War. There's a whole lot, of course, that happens after the First World War, and if you were a fan of the dailies or a host of other things, not part of this course. But I do think that in terms of bringing Chicago into modernity, that's a good place to stop. I also realized, preparing for this second lecture, that there are just so many things that I didn't talk about last time, won't talk about tonight, because it's the nature of the beast that in two lectures like this, a lot has to get pruned out. And that causes me a great deal of pain. So if during the course of the evening, you see me suddenly grit my teeth and go, ah! It's because I'm realizing about something that I would like to talk about but can't. That's it. Here we go. I divided the lecture into three categories here this evening, three parts. They're not equal parts. And it struck me that I want to emphasize some drivers of city growth that I talked about last time but didn't acknowledge as such. Technology, the organization of labor, capital, and whatnot, immigrants who of all sorts, and I should just say migrants, I guess, and people who are willing to risk money on this venture. And that's been true about Chicago from the get-go. This was in the 1830s, not exactly a safe bet. So from then on, one of the things that has helped Chicago become what it is the willingness of people with money to put it into things that are sometimes a little novel and sometimes a little risky. As we get into the second, can't advance my slides here. Nope. Help? Okay. This is the population growth chart that I showed you last time. We were all in kind of the left-hand side of that growth chart last time, and now we get into the big stuff where the curve goes up like crazy. And one of the things that made Chicago extraordinary in the period from, say, 1870, post-Civil War, into the early 20th century is how fast it was growing, not just how big it was growing, but how fast. And as I mentioned before, that was unparalleled in the time when Chicago was becoming this. There are lots of big cities that were bigger than Chicago at this time, but they took a long time to get there. And there were cities that grew very fast, but they didn't get this big. So those things have consequences for what Chicago became. And I'm going to start back where I left off the last time, in a situation where in the late 1860s, just on the brink of the fire, there are really two Chicagos. There's the Chicago that the O'Learys lived in. That's their house there on DeKoven Street. And then there's the society of people who have money, who are interested in the welfare of the city as a whole and have the wherewithal to try to influence it. And I used Graceland Cemetery as a symptom of that, something that also happened in the 1860s, a large landscaped cemetery on the outskirts of what was then Chicago, and a place that it became, as most of you know, the resting place of the power elite in Chicago. They're all there up there in that corner. That's another kind of representation of another Chicago. And this two Chicagos theme runs throughout the history, but who's in which category and what those categories are like changes over time. So I left you with the fire last time. We burned down the city. And this map shows what burned. And I think what didn't burn is at least as important as what did. Make no mistake, this was a calamity. It left a third of the city's population homeless. It wiped out the central business district and a lot of the north side. That burned area goes all the way up to Fullerton Avenue, at that time the northern boundary of the city. So there's an enormous amount of devastation here. Of course, a colossal amount of money sunk into things that were destroyed and so forth. But if you look at the map, what you see is that there's a lot of Chicago, even in 1871, that was not touched by the fire. And a lot of that was important for the recovery. The fire destroyed the Loop, and it destroyed a good chunk of the north side, but mostly east of the river. Now, on the north branch of the Chicago River at this time, there were metalworking facilities, there was a big rolling mill, there are all kinds of things up there that are important to the economy of the city, and they were untouched. Moving south, the fire jumped over the river down there near the O'Leary Cottage, burned its way through the northern part of the Loop. It did not go very far south. So there's an awful lot of Chicago untouched down there, including the stockyards, a lot of other major economic facilities on the south branch of the Chicago River, the canal facilities, mostly untouched by the fire. And all that meant that you have the wherewithal for recovery afterward. And what's more, the Chicagoans were very eager about the recovery. And there was a number of them in the immediate aftermath of the fire, before the thing was really cooled down very much, were taking transportation, trains to New York City. Why? Because New York money helped to build Chicago in the first place. There was a lot of investments in the 1830s by New Yorkers. It was venture capital people, as we would call them now. And now they're going back to New York, as well as other places, to look for the money to rebuild. And they were quite successful. A lot of people recognized what's illustrated in this map and were willing to sink money into a city that had been largely destroyed in order to help it recover very rapidly, which it did. So in the aftermath of the fire, there's a story about Chicago's reputation that grows, and the city council and others, very savvy about what to do with this, made the emblem of the phoenix important in Chicago's visual representation, emphasized regrowth. A lot of those people with money rebuilding in the Loop and on the north side built buildings that were bigger and grander than the ones that had been there before, and of course more fireproof. And the city, in its recovery mode, established what they called fire limits at the time, which was a whole zone of downtown Chicago in which you could not build in frame. You had to build in brick or stone. Chicago had been a city of wood largely beforehand. Now in the central area, at least, that was no longer to be the case. So there are all these kind of big things that happen very quickly after the fire, and they mean that the Chicago that emerged in the late 19th century was not only quickly recovered, but different from the one that had been there before. And the story of Chicago's disaster and recovery, which savvy Chicagoans promoted in all sorts of books and pamphlets and whatever media they could. That's something else to sell. And for people of lesser means, there's a lively market in souvenirs of the fire, pieces of charred wood or whatever people could find that they wanted to sell. Chicago made hay out of the event of the fire, the aftermath, the recovery. It becomes a topic of conversation. And in the process, it seems to me, if Carl were here, he could explain this much better than I can, but Chicago's disaster and recovery story and its recovery as something better story, something more modern than it had been before, plugged into a lot of representations of American growth and progress popular at the time. I feel obligated to show this picture. I show it in almost every course I teach, as does my absent colleague, Carl Smith. It's a nice representation of popular thinking about the United States in the 1870s. I don't know if I can make this cursor work, but let's find out. That's not working. I'll describe what's going on here. The giant figure of the loosely clothed woman in the center of this represents American progress. And she has a coil of telegraph wire over her arm, and she's stringing the telegraph behind her. And she carries a book symbolic of education and learning and the common school and so forth. And then there's this procession of things going on below. On the left-hand side, you see indigenous people who are moving west, fleeing the things that are happening behind them. And one of them is turning around and looking at that woman in the sky. God knows what he's thinking. But then you've got stagecoaches and pioneers and building of little villages and the railroad and, of course, the telegraph. And all this is symbolic of American progress moving westward. And Chicago becomes part of that story. It's no longer at the edge of the West, but it's west of a lot of other things in the United States at that time. And Chicago can claim still some role in that. And all this gets tied up with those things I mentioned at the beginning that are drivers of the growth and progress of big cities, especially Chicago, technology, and the ability to organize big ventures, the ability to take advantage of migration streams, and finally, the availability of money from people who are ready to invest it. And this is one of those gap moments where I can't talk about things that I would talk about a lot here, having to do with investment and technology and the creation of corporations and a whole new wave of Chicago entrepreneurs in the aftermath of the Civil War, and all that's gone. I should mention, by way of a plug, I suppose, that although I'm cramming an awful lot of Chicago history into two relatively short sessions here, I am going to be giving a 9-week version of Chicago history for the Northwestern Alumni Association. I believe there are some members of that association in the audience. And it's open to enrollment by a lot of people. And that will cover a lot of other things that I can't do tonight. Central to a lot of this change in, I'm stuck here. We got to American progress. How come we can't get past that? It's not that it's just static.
You see that review on a slideshow?
Yeah.
You have to click that.
Okay.
I don't know why.
Okay. There we go. One of the things that happens in this wave of enthusiasm in which Chicago is taking part is infatuation amongst lots of Americans with new technology, and indeed very striking new technology. This is the Corliss steam engine that was built to power the Philadelphia World's Fair in 1876, commemorating the birth of the nation. And it's a colossal machine, as you can see by the people standing around it. This two-cylinder walking beam steam engine drove all of the machinery in the fair through complicated shafts and belts and whatnot. It was also an exhibit in it of itself. A lot of people were just astonished by the scale of this thing. It represents in some ways, a kind of new stage of perfection in the making of steam engines in general. Plenty of steam engines around earlier. They were mostly inefficient. This one is far more efficient than those earlier ones. It could generate a great deal of power and make good use of inputs to get outputs and so on. And it became a symbol of all the things that I've been talking about here. Chicago did not have this machine in the beginning, but it did later on. George Pullman, when he established his town and factory for making railway cars, and his highly organized and incredibly advanced technologically manufacturing process, he bought this thing, the steam engine, and had it shipped from Philadelphia to Chicago and put back together again. And it drove all the machinery in the Pullman factory beginning in the 1880s. So you can see you've got people who are grabbing a hold of the modern, so to speak, and attaching it to Chicago and then bragging about it and making it a showpiece. And this is a repeated phenomenon over and over again. Chicago also became the site of another memorable event that wraps all these themes together, the Great Railway Time Convention in 1873. The introduction of railroads that were long distances ran afoul of old-fashioned sun time. Up until the middle of the 19th century, people basically kept time by the rising and setting of the sun, and you set your local clocks accordingly, and the clock in the town square might have been the master clock, but the clock in the town square in Peoria was not going to say the same thing as the clock in Chicago, not going to say the same thing as the clocks in Iowa. And so if you're traveling on a long distance railway train, it's hard to know what time it is. That's important if you're the locomotive engineer and you have a schedule to make. So the railway companies got together and organized this convention at which they divided the nation, and eventually other gatherings did the same thing for the world, into these vertical time zones. So that although the sun is not in the same place within these boundaries, it's the same time in all those places. So it's sun's not rising in Iowa at the same time that it's rising in Chicago, but it's the same time in both places according to the clocks. And the railway system drove this, but then of course it became part of the apparatus through which we live our lives. And it's happened here in Chicago. Chicago was a center of an enormous railway network by this time. A lot of the railway companies had major offices or headquarters here. So it's a logical place to meet and to make this nation-changing and ultimately global-changing innovation. Now, it's not, they didn't invent this idea. Other people earlier had talked about time zones and even made proposals for it. But here's where it got crystallized. Here's where it became something real. The building there, the Grand Pacific Hotel, is not there anymore, but there is a plaque downtown in the building that stands where it stood that commemorates the railway time convention. So what you've got here is a whole lot of things feeding together to make Chicago's post-Civil War growth dramatic, rapid, and emblematic of a lot of things going on in the country. And probably nothing did that so dramatically as the rise of the iron and steel industry in the United States. Chicago is hardly the only place where they were making iron and steel. And there are other places which could argue they're at least as important, Pittsburgh, for example, being one. My mind is cluttered with whatever happened within the last week in many cases. And this past week, I went to a convention in Pittsburgh, and we went on a tour of the ruins of the blast furnaces on the Monongahela River. But Chicago became an early leader amongst early leaders in the new technologies of processing iron and making steel in large quantities. This is a map that shows the iron and steel plants that eventually spread across the Chicago region. It's a map taken from the Encyclopedia of Chicago, which is available online. If you go to the Chicago History Museum website, there's a link on their home page. This is a map that shows a lot of sites that are now defunct, but it also shows how important Chicago was in the latter part of the 19th century, first half of the 20th, as a center of investment and innovation and activity, and also a center of employment. So these huge industries like the steel industry and like the many, many, many other kinds of factories that spread across Chicago in the latter part of the 19th century, they need employees. They're magnets for migration. That population curve that you saw going up like that has a lot to do with people moving into Chicago from the rest of the United States, and of course also from overseas. This was a place you went if you're looking for work, and especially if you're looking for work and you don't have high levels of skill. There are thousands of jobs, many of them awful jobs, dirty, dangerous, etc. But they're jobs, and there are all sorts of people flooding into Chicago looking for those jobs. And all of this is in many ways wrapped up in what became one of Chicago's most famous exports, and that is Mr. Pullman's railway cars. As I mentioned, he had a state-of-the-art factory in which he was manufacturing railway cars, especially sleeper cars. And one of the many innovations that he made was a relatively simple device or system for converting seats into beds, and into converting them into double-decker beds so that the panels above the seats fold down into beds. I don't know. There are people here probably old enough to have slept on a railway train with a Pullman turnout, right? How many of you have, yeah, okay, good. And I'm one of those people. Trains nowadays don't do this quite the same way, but in those days it was a huge innovation, and it became all the more important for Chicago when it was coupled with another Pullman innovation, which was the creation of the system of labor on board the trains. The porters who handle all these chores on the trains worked for George Pullman because he didn't sell his cars to the railroads, he leased them. And he leased them along with the labor staff that would run them on the railroad. So he's making money in a number of ways. Now, he also made very high-end luxury private coaches for rich people. And those, of course, didn't come with porters along with them. But a lot of the Pullman cars manufactured in this period in the late 19th century are done in a way that makes people more comfortable with long-distance train travel. If there were more time, I could talk about how Pullman sold these things, but the basic idea is that it becomes emblematic of the kinds of things that are happening in Chicago, and of course another driver of that population surge. One of the things this did was to push the settled area of Chicago outward, in part because a lot of those metalworking plants, steelworking plants, and places like Pullman needed land, needed access to the rail system, wanted to be in a place where they could put all the pieces of their enterprise together in new ways, like Pullman. And so they went out on the fringes. And this is a map from 1900. You can see, I hope, let's see if I can get this cursor to work. There we go. I don't know if it works here. But here's Lake Calumet as it once was. There's Pullman's town there. Across the lake there is a place called Irondale. Irondale is part of the enormous steel making complex along the Calumet River here. Some of you may remember that there used to be a giant U.S. Steel plant at the just above the mouth of the Calumet River. That's gone now, but it was one of lots of steel plants along this river on the far south side of Chicago. So it's driving physical growth, it's driving population growth. One of the things that Chicagoans did eventually is to annex a lot of these places, so that Pullman, which was in the beginning way outside the city limits of Chicago, and George Pullman wanted it that way, got swallowed by the city of Chicago, as did a host of other places. So it's getting bigger population-wise, it's getting bigger money-wise, it's getting bigger in area, all at the same time. This is not Chicago, but I thought some of you might be interested in knowing that Evanston's on the far periphery of Chicago as well. And Evanston's west side once had a huge manufacturing complex, lots of different kinds of factories over there making many, many different things. And one of the things they had was the Clayton Mark pipe making facility, which worked with hot metal and made pipes and fire hydrants and all kinds of other things. The picture you see here, I'm going to have to do this two ways, I think. This is Dodge Avenue. This is Dempster Street. You're looking toward the southeast here. This is the railroad, the Mayfair cutoff that used to run along the west side of Chicago. Okay, not showing up here. Let's do this another way. Whoop, we did not advance the slide, did we? I'm still stuck on Pullman. Yep. That's where I want. That's yeah, and then we want to be in the next slide along. Okay, yeah, that's what I want. Right. This is the Clayton Mark factory. Dodge, Dempster. There's a big shopping center here right now, but it was a major metalworking facility over there near the high school on the west side of Evanston. There are also, again, this is one of those GAC points, but there are all kinds of mementos of the industrial west side of Evanston that are still there, but we can't go there right now. I jumped farther ahead than I wanted. There we go. I talked about the way in which Chicago grew physically, swallowed up areas around it. This is a map of that process. The dark red area at the very center is the original city of Chicago when it was incorporated in the 1830s. And Chicago steadily began swallowing up other things all the way down into the 1890s. The last chunks being brought in being parts of Rogers Park and West Ridge, both once independent towns. And in the process, making Chicago a giant among cities in land area, and also bringing into the city and its tax base a lot of those industrial peripheral areas that I was just talking about. So down there at the bottom of the map, you can see Lake Calumet, which I was just talking about in terms of steel. So this process was both accompanied by and driven by changes in immigration. This is a chart of long-term arrivals in the United States from 1820 down to the early part of the 21st century. And you can see, I'm gonna have to do this two ways, I think. There is a surge here in the 1880s and the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century. And then a resumption, there's a depression here and a resumption of that surge afterwards for the benefit of those in the house. Here's the late 19th century surge, depression in the 1890s, big surge in the early years of the 20th century. And of course, a big surge in the period approaching where we are now. But those two big waves that I talked about in the beginning were referred to commonly back in the 20th century as the old and the new immigration. The old immigration was the kind that had been coming all through the 19th century. Irish, Germans, a lot of Northern European folks. The new immigration was the kind that began coming in significant numbers in the 1880s and 1890s. They were Southern and Eastern European folks, Italians, people from the Baltic, Poles, people who were different from the immigrants arriving earlier. Many of them were not Protestant Christians. A lot of them were not Christians at all. Some of them were from areas where languages very different from English or the Northwestern European languages were spoken. In other words, they were more alien than the people who had been coming before. And of course, there's a long history associated with that. But the point that's important for us is that Chicago, that spike in Chicago's population, that huge ramp I showed you in the beginning, coincides with the new immigration to the United States. Chicago is getting a huge share of those new Southern and Eastern European migrants. They're the ones who are working in the mills. They're the ones who are staffing all kinds of factories. They're the ones who arrive with very little money and find low-paying jobs with their jobs, and so on. And this process means that Chicago is acquiring immigrant communities of various sorts quite rapidly. All right, once again, I seem to be stuck. Oh, I gotta get rid of this thing here, I think. There we go. These are maps that show the concentrations of 3 different kinds of people as of 1910. I'm gonna do this in the reverse order this time. For the folks in the room, these are Irish arrivals, the old immigrants in Chicago. You could see they're scattered over huge parts of the city by 1910. These are people of Russian background, many of them Jewish. They have a big settlement on the near west side and some on the upper branch, but there aren't many of them in large parts of Chicago. And these are people born in Italy, and they're even more concentrated. They're on the west side, a little bit on the north side. The public housing complex that came to be known as Cabrini Green was originally the Mother Cabrini Homes, the first part of it. And it was meant to serve poor Italians on the north side long before it became famous for lots of other reasons. But what you got here is a pattern of population in Chicago that is bringing all kinds of people in and also creating different patterns of dispersion and concentration and different sorts of neighborhoods. Those immigrants tended to establish communities where land was cheap and often where the public health circumstances were very poor. The upper left-hand picture here is of people near the stockyards on the south side. This is a collection of women and children in the wintertime. They are looking for lumps of coal that have fallen off of railway cars. This is a common activity for poor people all over the United States. And of course, there are a lot of railroad tracks in Chicago. Freight cars, coal cars bounce and things fall off. And that coal is precious to people who can't afford to buy it, but are using it to heat their homes. The lower right photograph is from the near west side. It shows one of those neighborhoods of wooden houses, often rapidly constructed outside the fire limits of Chicago, and housing a lot of these new immigrants. Now, these neighborhoods are going to become really important a little later on, both in Chicago's history and in this lecture. So once again, what you get in the late 19th century as part of this change is 2 Chicagos. I showed you the pictures at the very beginning in the 1860s. The class divide has become even more dramatic by the 1890s. So what you have is a near West Side alley up there, a place rarely cleaned, where garbage is episodically collected, where all the people are poor, where the sanitary conditions are terrible, where epidemic disease is rampant. All the things that go with poor immigrant communities are especially powerful there. And then you got the mansion of the Palmer family, Potter Palmer, hotel owner, board of trade, speculator, lots of other things, and his wife Bertha, buried in Graceland Cemetery, I might add. Potter Palmer built this mansion, which people call the castle, on the first stretch of Lakeshore Drive, just north of Oak Street up there. Lakeshore Drive didn't go anywhere at that point. It fed into Lincoln Park, but it kind of ended there. Lakeshore Drive was meant to be a promenade for people like this along the lakefront. I think they would be rotating rapidly in their graves if they saw what Lakeshore Drive has become nowadays, an 8-lane commuter superhighway is not what they could possibly have imagined at the time. Two Chicagos, sometimes in conflict, lots of friction here. You've got very rich people, very poor people. You have economic conditions that are both extremely profitable for some people and exploitative for others. In the latter part of the 19th century, this makes Chicago not only a growth machine, not only a wonder of the United States, but also one of the centers of major conflict between labor and capital. And that manifested itself in all sorts of ways in the 1870s and 1880s. Many of you probably know that in the decade of the 1870s was almost entirely a decade of economic depression for the United States. A major economic downturn in 1873 left the economy in the dumps for most of the decade. And of course, it was poor people who got most harmed by this downturn. And then there was another depression in the 1890s, as I mentioned. And in general, a lot of people who are being exploited and come to recognize it. So that Chicago becomes one of the major centers of the great railway strike of 1877. Didn't start here, started in Pennsylvania, but it became a national strike. Indeed, some people would say it's the first real national strike in the United States, shuts down a large part of the railway system, and becomes a major flashpoint for people who own the railway companies, want to reopen the railway companies, don't particularly like organized labor to start with, and working class people who are trying to form unions in some cases and who are just generally protesting in others. It leads to violent conflict in a lot of places, including Chicago. The so-called Battle of the Viaduct occurred on the near southwest side, where around 16th Street and Halsted, where there were lots of working class people at the time and where there were rail facilities, and these things came together. It became a national sensation. It wasn't the only violent encounter of that era. There were many, but Chicago became a place of very dramatic encounters of this sort, and they got national publicity in magazines and other publications like this one. So what you've got is a kind of a tinderbox and for labor capital, labor management relations, a place where the economic future is changing very rapidly and hard to predict. Many people getting rich, a lot of people remaining in poverty, and it produces a lot of attempts to organize workers. And by this time, you've got lots of workers from Germany and German-speaking countries, as well as Eastern Europeans. A lot of them bring socialist ideas with them, and Chicago becomes a major organizing center for American socialism as well as for American labor. And there are all sorts of rallies like the one advertised in this poster. The culmination in a lot of ways in this late 19th century period of those rallies was the Haymarket event in 1884. This is a over-dramatized depiction in a national magazine of what happened. It does not depict what actually happened, but it depicts a lot of reactions to it, or at least it feeds a lot of reactions. The basic encounter involved workers gathering on a area of West Randolph Street, where there was a wide street and a bunch of area for people to stand. It was a rally commemorating the deaths of some workers at the McCormick plant a few days before, and the killing of people by police. This rally really didn't attract very many people. There were police in an alley nearby because they were afraid of violence. Late at night, people are going home. There's still speakers on the platform, but the police come out and say, time to disperse, and they say, all right. And then somebody, nobody knows who to this day, threw a dynamite bomb, which exploded between the workers and the police and led to a melee. The police, of course, said the bomb killed a lot of policemen, but later research has shown that really it was probably the melee that killed both workers and policemen, because both groups were armed. They were firing without aiming very well, and you've got a lot of casualties. And the city of Chicago, in response to this, said round up the usual suspects. 9 people were arrested, many of whom weren't even present at the Haymarket site. 4 of them, I should say, were eventually pardoned. 1 of them committed suicide in prison, and 4 were hanged. As you can see, the building in which this occurred is still standing on the near north side. It was the main place of imprisonment and also of execution in this time. And in the response to this amongst well-to-do Chicagoans was to fortify. This is an armory built on the near south side in the 1880s in response to the fear of violence. It's meant to be able to house a large body of troops in case of insurrection by the hoi polloi, and to be able to store large amounts of weapons ready at hand. And of course, the building itself is intimidating. Alas, not there anymore, but I mean, alas, from the point of view of us historians, not from the point of view of suppressing labor. But this is a symptom of the friction occurring in Chicago in the latter part of the 19th century. And then you begin to get something else that is, in my book, even more interesting. That is a whole host of ways of responding to the labor capital crisis, to the pains and pressures of growth in Chicago, arising from a lot of different people, some of whom came to Chicago because they wanted to witness and address the class conflict that was convulsing in the nation, and they saw this as one of the major centers. You want to learn about what's going wrong in the economy, you come to Chicago. You want to do something about what's going wrong in the economy, you come to Chicago. And of course, then there are plenty of Chicagoans who become concerned themselves and produce a lot of responses. Now, probably the most famous of these is the explosion of settlement houses in Chicago. Hull House is the most famous. That's the one on the lower left here. But Chicago became a center for settlement house, organizing. Northwestern University established its own settlement. That's the one in the lower right. And the University of Chicago and others sponsored Chicago Commons. There are more than a dozen settlement houses in Chicago alone by 1910, hundreds of them across the country. The nearest thing I can think of in recent times that resembles this is Teach for America, in which all kinds of young people, often college educated or just coming into adulthood, wanting to do something constructive and learn about the world, would find places to work and volunteer in settlement houses. This phenomenon did not begin just here. And in fact, Hull House was not the first settlement house in the United States. The Henry Street settlement in New York was established in the same summer of 1889 that Jane Addams and her friends opened Hull House. They are really the two founding institutions. Hull House became by far the most famous of these, in part because Jane Addams was a genius at fundraising and at organizing. And it became, starting with the Hull family's house, still standing there on the west side, a complex that occupied a whole city block. And you can see from this map all the different kinds of things that went on there. The building in the photograph on the right-hand side is the original Hull House. That other building is a wing built onto it for art studios and other purposes. All kinds of things happened at Hull House, and it became itself an attraction for people who wanted to do something about the class divide and knew that Chicago was a place to do it. Many things came out of Hull House. One of the most interesting from my point of view is that this is one of the centerpiece places in the United States for the innovation of reforms that were based on statistical data. And Florence Kelley, who came to volunteer at Hull House, was a major instrument in this change. She turned out to be a remarkable gatherer of data, and she borrowed from some people in Europe who were beginning to make color-coded maps that showed the distribution of various characteristics. These maps are from a published volume called Hull House Maps and Papers that came out in the 1890s. Florence Kelley was only one of a lot of people who came to Hull House, as many of you know. Many of them very innovative. They started things that became famous nationwide. One of their central concerns throughout was always the children of poor families growing up in that area. They found what you see on the left-hand side here. They created the first public playground across the street from Hull House as one means of response. They also generated a lot of interest in education. Anita McCormick Blaine, who was a wealthy lady of the Chicago's North Side. Anybody with the name McCormick in this period, you know. She had a lot of money, and she wanted to invest it in progressive activities. So she became very interested in establishing schools that were innovative. And John Dewey at the University of Chicago, of course, was interested in the same kinds of things. So you get things like the University of Chicago Lab School, which is down there on the bottom. And it's important not just because it represents an effort by privileged and prosperous people to help people who aren't, but also because a seed that spreads in lots of other places across the country, just as settlement houses spread across the country. And Chicago is both a nexus and a generator of this kind of class bridging activity in the latter part of the 19th century. I'm going to stop there for a break. Back again. Just back off for a second here from things I've been talking about. The picture I'm trying to paint is of a city that's extraordinary in many ways, but in many ways not unique. A lot of the things that I've been talking about happening here were happening in big cities across the country and to some extent the Western world. But Chicago, I think, is interesting not only because of the size of the events that happened here, but because it became both a focal point for forces coming together that created friction, but that were also generating new things, and the way in which it began exporting ideas and institutions, and in some cases technology, to other places. So that it's not unique, but it is extraordinary and important, I think, in its role in American history for that reason. So I was talking about the innovations of the progressive movement. All these people were progressives, many of which were centered in Chicago. Many of the most important progressives, including Jane Addams and a whole bunch of other people, were Chicagoans, at least for part of their lives. But that's not the only way in which Chicago was generating new and interesting ways of dealing with society, of confronting those problems of technology and the transformation of the country. And one of the things that happened in the course of this is that Chicago became the second city. The 1890 census was the first one to show that Chicago had surpassed Philadelphia to become the second largest city in the country, still a good deal smaller than New York, but into that second city role where it's going to be until the middle of the 20th century. The peak of Chicago's population growth came in 1950, But throughout the period I'm talking about today, this evening, you've got this curve that's going up and up and up, and in the period of the late 19th century, faster than other places. And part of that is just magnetic attraction of new people. Part of it is that swallowing up of peripheral areas that I talked about, all of which goes to make this giant thing called Chicago, which is generating all these interesting kinds of responses to the changes that are going on at the same time. And among many of the most interesting of these changes were ones that wanted to change the fabric of the city itself. Chicago in the late 19th century and the early 20th became a tremendous magnet for talent, especially for young people who were talented at this, that, or the other thing. And among those were a lot of people who became great shapers of the city of Chicago itself, in what some people call the Chicago Revolution in architecture. There's something of a dispute about the first true skyscraper in the United States between Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. The building in the upper left-hand corner there, the home insurance building, is Chicago's claimant to the title. It was built, the first large building of this sort in Chicago, with a steel frame with open window patterns so that lots of light came in and lots of fresh air, and depended on elevators to reach the upper floors. Chicago, the home insurance building was finished in 1884. There were a bunch of other architects and engineers beginning to try the same thing elsewhere. But Chicago became the place to be. If you were a young architect, you wanted to learn from other architects, you wanted to see what they were doing, and the results are transforming the skyline of Chicago very rapidly in the 80s and 90s and into the early 20th century. And you can see the names here. A lot of these people became very famous in their own rights later on, but they came to Chicago when they were young. And they produced these spectacular buildings, many of which are still standing, all of which share those characteristics of the use of very advanced technology at the time: steel frames, open window patterns, elevators, high buildings with many stories, many of which were built as corporate headquarters. Remember that you've got giant corporations coming into being here to run the railroads and the industries and so forth. Giant corporations can't operate as they do nowadays by having dispersed employees with laptops all over the place. They've got to all be in the same place if the company's going to, the management side of the company is going to work properly. And central city land is expensive. Corporations don't want to spend more money than they have to, and they will pay for the building to go up so that they're getting the area that they need to house their employees on a relatively limited plot of land. That's what drives the skyscraper boom. It's the need of these giant companies for office space. And it produces buildings that are both functional and innovative and, in my view, beautiful. Ornaments to the skyline, ornaments to the streets of downtown Chicago. And we are fortunate in having a lot of them. There are clusters of them in every big city in the United States now, but we have a virtual museum of the history of American architecture in the downtown of Chicago, in the Loop area of Chicago. And Chicago then also became what I'm calling an incubator for young architectural talent. This is Steinway Hall, which was a building built by the Steinway Piano Company. But it became a place where young architects set up studios. And at one time or another, all of these people were in that building. Many of them overlapped. They all knew each other. They all studied each other's work. And that's how you get a kind of creative explosion a little later on. And it's not the only building like this. There are places in downtown Chicago, the Auditorium building, Adler and Sullivan's big building on Grant Park, also had architects in its upper reaches, their own offices. Adler and Sullivan were up there. Frank Lloyd Wright got work as a draftsman in that building when he first came to Chicago. And out of this this collection of talent and city building talent, physical city building talent, architecture began to morph into something else. And of course, one of the leading people in this movement was Daniel Burnham, the well-fed gentleman on the left. Daniel Burnham was a very successful architect before he became arguably the first city planner, professional city planner in the United States. He did the Santa Fe building, which you see there in the center of the images here. He was one of the people who worked on the Monadnock building, which is down there on the lower right. He designed Union Station, which is still, for my money, has one of the most beautiful interiors of buildings in Chicago. So all these things set him up, as well as other people of his generation, as innovators in architecture, and made Chicago a famous city all through this period as a center of innovation. But Chicago was still that two Chicago's place. Hundreds of thousands of very poor people in terrible living conditions in the back streets of Chicago without adequate water supply or drainage or sewerage, and large numbers of very affluent people who were building fancy structures to live in and to work in Chicago. And the consciousness of this class split and the way in which Chicago was a manifestation in its politics, in its economy, of these huge divisions that are besetting the country as a whole, continue to play out. And Chicago's leaders were aware that the city had a bad reputation in the 1890s. People on the East Coast thought of it as a kind of upstart city, dirty, uncouth. There was a famous visitor who came here and said, having seen Chicago, I urgently desire never to see it again. It's full of people spitting everywhere. So one of the things that Chicago's elite did to try to help Chicago's reputation was to organize a campaign to host a World's Fair. There had been a Philadelphia World's Fair to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. There were other World's Fairs being promoted elsewhere. The Chicago people wanted to get in on that action and make use of it as a public relations venture. And I think you could argue that this is one of the most successful public relations ventures in American history. The World's Fair of 1893 was created by a committee of the power elite of Chicago, businessmen of Chicago, the head of the First National Bank, the heads of some of the major industrial corporations, and so on. They put in a bid with Congress to host a World's Fair to commemorate the Columbian voyages of 1492. It was supposed to happen in 1892. They couldn't quite pull it off, so it happened in 1893. But the mere act that Congress chose Chicago to host this World's Fair was like a thunderbolt for people on the East Coast. They thought it would be in Philadelphia or in New York or maybe in Washington, places that were recognized as successful and properly mannered cities, not that uncouth thing out there on the prairie. So the Chicagoans knew this, and they were determined to make these people look bad. So they hired the Olmsted architectural firm to design the fairgrounds, a map of which you see here. They hired Daniel Burnham to be the chief architect of the whole enterprise. Carl Smith, if he were here, would have a lot to say about this because he wrote a good book about Daniel Burnham. That says a lot about Burnham's involvement with this fair, which became a transformative event for him as well as for the city. Burnham was responsible for establishing rules that tried to standardize the architectural style of the World's Fair in a kind of classical mode. And he browbeat other architects into designing buildings that would fit that mode, except for Louis Sullivan, who refused to cooperate and whose building was multicolored and very unclassical and annoyed Daniel Burnham no end. But the fair did take on this neoclassical style. It also was tremendously innovative in terms of technology. It made use of electricity, then a phenomenon most Americans were not acquainted with. Electricity was being used in the 1890s in factories and places, in some high-end department stores. Very, very few people had electric lights in their homes. They made lavish use of electricity here. Hundreds of thousands of electric lights, electric bulbs lit the place up at night. It had electric pumps that would drive the water to make these fountains that you see in the picture. They carved out canals, and they even had, as you can see a little bit in this picture, an imitation of the canals of Venice here. All of this being attractive, as a good architect would want, but also in itself a showcase of modern technology and what could be done with it in ways that had not been done before. And the fair, which was only there for one summer in 1893, was a phenomenal success. Millions of people visited the fair, many more people than lived in the city of Chicago. People from the East Coast wrote back home about it, saying, this is amazing. And there was one letter that said, you got to drop everything, whatever you're doing, and come see this. So it was a success that way. And of course, it was a success for Daniel Burnham as the chief organizer of the whole thing. There were other things happening at the fair that Daniel Burnham was not responsible for, but that also impressed people and that affected the reputation of Chicago as a place of innovation, a place of modernity, a place that was at the cutting edge of cities in the United States, and so on. Probably the most famous of these was the Ferris wheel. It was not officially part of the fair itself. It was in what's now the Midway Plaisance at the University of Chicago, which was a kind of annex to the fair, where there were all kinds of exhibits that were not officially sanctioned, and things like the Ferris wheel. This was designed by an American engineer named George Ferris, who had been to the Great Paris World's Fair in 1889, the centerpiece of which was the Eiffel Tower. And he saw this thing, amazing marvel of steel and iron construction, and said, I want to do something like that and make it move. So he built this colossal wheel and put it on the Midway. It was of a scale that's hard to imagine nowadays, much bigger than the Ferris wheel outside Navy Pier, not as big as the London Eye and some other things that have appeared later. But it was by far the tallest thing in Chicago. And it took some people higher off the ground than they had ever been in their lives. Those cabins there, pretty much everybody in this room, or yeah, everybody in this room could fit in 2 of those cabins. They weren't, it's like not like your, plastic seats at the Carnival Ferris wheel. This was an amazing creation of engineering. The shaft that, and you could see on the right-hand picture, the axle on which the whole thing turned was at that time the largest piece of steel that had ever been forged. And it's not for, a bridge or a battleship or something. It's for what is basically a giant toy, an amusement machine, something that makes people have fun. The Ferris wheel was dismantled and reassembled for a while in Lincoln Park in Chicago, but then eventually it was torn down and sold for scrap. So alas, we can't ride the Ferris wheel anymore. I really wish we could, but we can't do that. The fair as a whole was a thing much talked about across the country, and it promoted the reputation of Daniel Burnham, the chief architect. He was then hired to do other things beyond just the buildings that he had done so far. The Senate of the United States, which had a public relations problem of a different sort, they recognized that people were saying the whole country was in uncouth bumpkin, and that Washington in particular was a mud hole, unsanitary, with unpaved roads and a lot of problems of its own. So the Senate commission headed by Senator McMillan hired Daniel Burnham to make a master plan for the downtown area of Washington. Excuse me, building on the work of Pierre L'Enfant, who designed the original downtown area plan with all the diagonals and circles and other things that are nightmares for automobile drivers these days. What Burnham did was to build upon that sketchy plan and make it into something much grander. And he produced the basis for Washington as we know it pretty much today. The mall existed at the time, but it was swampy. It was not well maintained. There was a railroad station in the middle of it for trains that ran through Washington, and Burnham wanted to clear all that stuff out and make it into the grand panoramic extent that we see today. The Washington Monument was already there, but he made sites for other monuments, the Lincoln Memorial and ultimately the Jefferson Memorial. They didn't exist at this point, but he's thinking ahead to future monuments for Americans. All those black buildings you see in this picture, Burnham expected to be the expansion of the federal government. And that big triangle there is what we nowadays know as Federal Triangle. It's full of neoclassical buildings that followed basically the scheme that Burnham sketched out. None of them were there when Burnham made this plan, but they all followed along with it. So one of the ways in which Washington is spectacular today, those enormously broad avenues suitable for parades, all the open spaces amidst the federal buildings, the mall itself, the monuments, all that kind of thing bears the influence of Daniel Burnham. Not just Daniel Burnham, but of Daniel Burnham primarily in this period. It also gave him a reputation, not just as an architect, but as what would later be called a city planner. City planning was in its infancy in this period. There had been little stabs at large-scale land planning in the 19th century. There was no such thing as a professional city planner at this point, but there would be soon, and Daniel Burnham is arguably the first one of those. And he, having done this for Washington and having produced the World's Fair in Chicago, he got hired for other commissions. And he designed parts of several other American cities. I had, at this point in the lecture, a bunch of images from Cleveland, my place, but where Daniel Burnham did some work too, but I got rid of those because time's a wasting. And he designed a large part of the capital, the downtown area of the capital of Manila, newly acquired by the United States at that point, and a lot of other work in other places around the country that fell under the label of city planning. And he sort of created the profession in a way. He was called back to Chicago by a club of businessmen that many of whom had been involved in the World's Fair of 1893, who wanted him to work his magic in Chicago, and the plan of Chicago became his masterpiece. He brought to bear a lot of the ideas he'd acquired elsewhere and other people had suggested to him. He was, like a lot of land planners and architects of his day, very taken by what the Baron Haussmann had done in Paris half a century earlier. But the Baron Haussmann worked for an emperor who could just decree that things would happen. Land planning in the United States doesn't work that way. But all of a sudden, Daniel Burnham has a lot of clout behind him. A lot of very rich and influential people in Chicago who want him to make Chicago prettier, more efficient, a better place. And the Plan of Chicago, which is a remarkable document, you can read it online nowadays if you want to, was itself an amazing achievement. It was aimed at making the transportation system of Chicago more efficient, railroads, roadways, local public transit, streetcars, other things all work better. It was aimed at creating traffic flow patterns that would be, what should I say, carefully defined, and that would open the way for more efficiency that way. Burnham knew about the automobile, although he had no idea what Henry Ford was going to do in the following decade. So one of the things that about Daniel Burnham's plan, and a lot of the pictures based on it, is there are not many cars in them, and that becomes an issue down the road. But the plan itself was spectacular. And he had the advantage of a very talented watercolorist who made images of what Chicago might look like if Daniel Burnham's planning ideas were carried out. This is a hypothetical, fanciful notion of what the waterfront might look like, with a great artificial harbor adjacent to Grant Park, a lot of whole strings of artificial islands up and down the lakeshore. Some of that came into being. The harbor is there. There is a peninsula down there that hosts the museum campus, and it has a little artificial lagoon. Navy Pier on the north side, which appears here in a much enhanced fashion, did in fact get extended and become something more glamorous. And then, of course, the whole chain of public parks along the lakeshore, which did not exist at this point, was influenced by ideas about what this might look like. The Burnham Plan became a sort of foundational document for planning in the United States in many ways, and a foundational document for things that happened in Chicago long after Burnham was dead. At least until recently, maybe still, it is an official Chicago planning policy that Lakeshore Drive should be extended to Evanston. Lakeshore Drive was built in chunks, the first piece being down there where Potter Palmer lived, and it was not joined together into one chain until the 1930s. But Burnham had the idea that it should stretch the whole length of Chicago, and the whole length of Chicago meant up to Evanston. I don't think you'd get those people in those high-rise condos north of Hollywood Avenue to agree to this nowadays, but it shaped a lot of the landscape for decades to come in the way Chicago was planned. He also wanted to redo downtown. This is a view, another one of those watercolors, looking north from the south branch of the Chicago River at the junction with the north branch, where they both flow off to the right here in this picture used to flow into Lake Michigan. Again, a lot of treatments of the water's edge to make it appealing, efficient for traffic. The double-decker highway there, which exists in part in Wacker Drive now, was designed to separate freight traffic, heavy trucks and other vehicles, onto the lower level where they could load and unload into buildings that were adjacent, and everyday traffic on the upper level. It works in Wacker Drive pretty well. Wacker Drive did not reach the extent that is suggested in this picture, but it's one of the things that did happen as a result of the Burnham Plan. Carl Smith was kind enough to share with me the PowerPoint that he was going to use tonight for this presentation. I have monkeyed with it a lot and stuck in things that he didn't have in his. And unfortunately, I edited out a whole lot of slides having to do with the Burnham Plan, not because I don't like them or they aren't interesting or aren't beautiful, but because there's a clock. And there are other things I wanted to talk about as well. But here I am again promoting Carl Smith's book. He has a wonderful book about Daniel Burnham and his plan, which will say all the things I'm saying better and have many more illustrations that I'm offering here tonight. It was, however, hugely influential. Even after Burnham was dead, he died in the second decade of the 20th century, partly because of his friends. He had wealthy and powerful friends, the same guys who had hired him to do the World's Fair, and many of the same people who had brought him back to do the plan of Chicago. They had clout in Chicago and in the state. So they were able to make things happen that probably would have not have happened in other cities. North Michigan Avenue, for example. There was no Michigan Avenue bridge across the river at that time. And there's no North Michigan Avenue where the Magnificent Mile is nowadays. That was a little dinky street called Pine Street. The rich and powerful friends of Daniel Burnham managed to acquire the ability to buy up all the property on one side of Pine Street, tear down all those structures, widen the street into an extension of Michigan Avenue. And in the early 1920s, they opened the famous offset bridge from one piece of Michigan Avenue to the other. Daniel Burnham was long dead at that point, but they are working hard to carry out parts of his plan. Charles Wacker, whose name is on Wacker Drive, was one of these associates. And he published a book called Wacker's Manual of the Plan of Chicago. I own a copy of this book, and at this point I meant to wave it in front of you, but I forgot to bring it along. Wacker's Manual was designed for use in public schools in Chicago. The idea being that you train up young Chicagoans from an early age to believe that the plan must be fulfilled. Daniel Burnham's plan must be implemented in its entirety. So you got all kinds of people in Chicago who knew about the Burnham plan, who ordinarily probably would not have been part of that elite of people who were dealing with it. You got political clout, you got money. So all kinds of things happen in Chicago, including Wacker Drive and the bridge and North Michigan Avenue that would not have happened probably otherwise. The plan was never fulfilled in its entirety, but it did have a huge impact on what Chicago is like today. So the emergence of modern Chicago. This is modern Chicago, the Burnham plan, and it had its impact so that 21st century Chicago still is heavily influenced by this kind of modernity that came into physical being at the beginning of the 20th century in this period. Now, I have to switch gears because I feel obligated to talk about what you might call the dark underbelly of things going on in Chicago in this period. Lots of glorious things, lots of influential things, lots of creative things going on in Chicago. But Chicago, like the rest of the United States, was afflicted by some ideas and some practices that afflict us in the Chicago of today. The same generation of people who founded settlement houses, who created schools designed for young children, who tried to implement the Burnham Plan, who did all these wonderful and progressive things, they were also inheritors of a set of ideas about race that came out of the 19th century, got reinforced in the late 19th century, and shaped a lot of the evolution of Chicago in the 20th century in ways not fortunate for a lot of the inhabitants. This is a diagram from a picture from an illustration from an encyclopedia. And illustrations like this were all over the place in the 1890s and the early 20th century. I learned at one point that there was a poster that was up in one of the classrooms at Northwestern University that depicted the races of man. And of course, these illustrations were created by the people at the top. So guess who gets to be at the top? White people of various kinds. And the further down, the more you get into people of color. This idea that there were genetically determined hierarchical categories of human beings was deeply set in the minds of a lot of people who otherwise were progressive and modern and whatnot in Chicago and elsewhere. And although the conception of race evolved in the 20th century, the implementation of ideas about race into physical phenomena tied up with the history of Chicago in important ways. In the second and third decades of the 20th century, Chicago was the recipient of huge numbers of African Americans migrating from the South. This map shows the areas of heavy concentration of African Americans in the late 19th century, early 20th century South. It also shows how railroads emanating from Chicago tapped directly into those areas. So Chicago, along with New York and a couple of other places, became a major recipient of out-migration of African Americans. Many of them came in the teens, the 19-teens, because there was work in Chicago, oftentimes work that was initially as scabs, strike breakers, but people who were willing to hire them in lots of capacities, and they could make a lot more money than they could in the South. They came because they are fleeing the reimposition of racial segregation in the so-called redemption period of late 19th century, the rise of Jim Crow, the segregation of almost every public space in the South, the imposition of penal codes that doomed an awful lot of Black people to chain gangs and other terrible forms of imprisonment. All these things are incentives to leave. And in the teens, especially during World War I, when there's a huge expansion of industry in places like Chicago, and where there's even more jobs than before, you begin to get this flood, which continues into the 20s, interrupted by the Great Depression in the 1930s, resumed in even greater numbers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and made Chicago at one point home to the largest or second largest urban African American population in the United States on the South Side. African Americans were among many of these migrant streams to Chicago. A lot of people who were Eastern Europeans, or especially those who came from minority religions like Jewish people, experienced great hardships in Chicago when they first came. The African Americans were the most confined, the most discriminated against, the most and the longest term bottom category in Chicago thinking in the 20th century. And that manifested itself in these concentrations. Now, these are maps that show, they're from that same year I showed you earlier, 1910. The one on the left-hand side is the map showing the concentration of Italians. Italians were in some ways, in the early part of the 20th century, as discriminated against as Black people were. And indeed, there were interviews with landlords in Chicago about who were desirable tenants, and Black people and Italians were at the bottom of the list. And Italian peoples were the victims of all kinds of discrimination. And it's manifested to some extent in this crowding. But over time, Italians became Italian Americans. They managed to move out into other areas. They became, in the eyes of many Americans, white. And so what you've got is the Black migrants in the thousands who are still confined on the South Side. That pattern on the right-hand side is the beginning of what became known as the Black Belt. It was there in 1910. It expanded with the Great Migration of the teens and 20s. It expanded and pushed outward in the middle years of the 20th century. But it's there always in much of the 20th century, and the consequences are with us still. In 1919, when Americans who had participated in World War I were demobilized and sent home, there were a lot of troops from Chicago that had been recruited and that had fought in Europe, and they were both white and Black in very large numbers. And they came back to Chicago, and as is the case with almost every large-scale war of this sort, happened again after World War II. You have a lot of young men in this case. There weren't too many women yet. A lot of young men coming home, having been through grueling experiences, having accumulated a little bit of pay, military pay, who want to get married, start families, move out of their parents' houses, have their own little version of American dream. And white Americans in Chicago fed that outward sprawl of Chicago in the 20s and 30s that was making the city still bigger. There are Black soldiers coming back too. And indeed, the South Side Black community had raised an extraordinary number of troops who fought in World War I. Some of you may have seen a monument. There's a tower at the corner of 35th and King Drive, which is a monument constructed by the Black community to honor the Black soldiers who died in World War I. There were a lot of them, but when they came home, they don't have their opportunities ahead of them as the white people did. But a lot of them are coming back to the Black Belt. The Black Belt's already crowded. They are looking for housing. They're pushing at the edges. In many cases, they are bold enough to move into areas where they're mostly white people. And in 1919, in the summer of 1919, there occurred an explosion, largely fueled by these kinds of developments. Started on a beach at 31st Street. There were public beaches at 31st Street in those days. They were segregated by race. There was a white people's beach. There was a Black beach. They were adjacent to each other. Hot summer day, a lot of people there on the beaches. Some Black teenagers were floating around on a raft out in Lake Michigan, and they drifted from the area off the Black beach into the area off the white beach. They were attacked by white teenagers who started throwing bricks and other things at them. One of the Black teenagers got hit, fell off the raft, drowned, was killed. That set off a huge fight on the beach between Black and white people. There's already this sort of tinderbox because of the aftermath of World War I and this pressure on housing, and it spread back inland. And you get 3 days of rioting in which there's this line that you can see on the map. For the benefit of people in the room, you can see this corridor right along there. There are railroad tracks along there. They largely separated white from Black. And there were episodes of physical violence, people who were beaten to death, people who were shot, African Americans dragged off streetcar cars and hung from lampposts, white gangs from the South Side Stockyards area making incursions into the African American community, starting fires, beating people up. This went on for 3 days, and finally the National Guard came in and put a cap on it. But one of the things that happened out of this was that, and this is kind of extraordinary given when it happened, was that the state of Illinois commissioned a study about this, and it produced a big fat volume, which is in our library over there if you want to go look, called The Negro in Chicago. And it was a really in-depth study of housing conditions and working conditions and basically what had happened to Black people. This map comes out of that that volume. The idea was it's one of the first of a genre in the United States of official investigations in the aftermath of riots to try to explain the riots. The largest and most famous of those was the ones that came in 1968 and the investigation afterward. But this is an early example of the same thing. The African-American South Side did expand. You've got all these people looking for housing, and gradually they're beginning to find little bits and pieces. It first sort of swelled out from that long strip that you saw toward the east into what's now the Hyde Park, Kenwood area, and areas just north of that. And then there's this sort of hard line on the west side that doesn't really get broken until much later, but it goes south. And this map shows the expansion of that African-American community. It also shows the way in which that expansion was accompanied by more violence. All those little red dots on there are episodes of violence associated with Blacks trying to find housing. This is from the early to mid 20th century that continued into the post-war years. All through the 1950s and 1960s, there are race riots of a small scale sort when Black people move into white areas. This is all a legacy of the period I've been talking about. And of course, alas, it is part of modern Chicago. When we talk about modernity in Chicago, this is a piece of it. The other side of this, and I'm going to end with this tonight, is that the migration of all those people into the South Side, which for a while made this community on the South Side one of the two largest African-American communities in the world, the other one being Harlem in New York. All those people moving in included a lot of very talented people, and the South Side of Chicago, the Black Belt area, became a kind of breeding ground for talent in a lot of ways, of all sorts. My former colleague Adam Green here at Northwestern has written a really interesting book about the way in which Black people on the South Side not only created a significant part of the American music industry, but also made corporate fortunes in publication and licensing and recording and so forth out of that venue. In the period I'm talking about now, the early 20th century, among those migrants who came to Chicago, there were some extraordinary people. One of them was Ida B. Wells, who got chased out of her hometown under threat of being lynched because she had dared to write a newspaper editorial denouncing lynching. She came to Chicago. Actually, she came to see the World's Fair and decided she liked it here. She married Ferdinand Burnett, who was the first Black graduate of the Northwestern Law School, and they became a power couple on the South Side, financing all kinds of endeavors and supporting all kinds of other creative people. There were businesses that sprang up on the South Side. This is the Supreme Liberty Life Insurance building. It's still there at the corner of King Drive and 35th Street, right next to that monument. This was a life insurance company started by Black people because white life insurance companies wouldn't sell policies to Black people. It became either the largest or the second largest Black-owned business in the United States, with offices all across the Midwest, and it made the careers of some important businessmen and trained a lot of others. Archibald Motley came out of that Black South Side, one of the premier painters of the early to mid 20th century. That's a self-portrait up there on the upper left. In addition to all these creative things, there's a basis for politics. Oscar de Priest, who migrated to Chicago from the South, established a career here, became an alderman in the teens, and became in 1929 the first Black person elected to Congress since Reconstruction. You got a political base there in all those people. His successor in that congressional seat was Dawson, Charles Dawson, who's going to become a power in the middle of the 20th century. But it all starts back here in this period. So there are all kinds of legacies from making modern Chicago. Some of them are physical, and you can see them. There's the Board of Trade building and the 20th Century Limited and North Michigan Avenue, thanks to Daniel Burnham's friends and so forth. I could fill up many more screens with things that came out of this period that have their roots in this period of modernity, and also with extensions of a lot of these other stories. But I'm going to quit right here. I thank you very much.
We have time for questions, but before we do that, I would like to announce the mini course that will take place in the winter so that you can get prepared. It will be on Tuesdays. We are trying to change the date, so some people cannot do Wednesday, so maybe they can do Tuesday. It will be February 6th and 13th, 2 Tuesdays, and it will be by Professor Soyini Medicine, who comes from performance studies, and her topic will be avant-garde art in the Black world. You'll get information, publicity, you'll know that, but bear it in mind and put it already in your calendar. And now I think we can start with the questions.
Thank you. We just have time for 1 or 2 questions. Thank you.
Just a quick question. My understanding, you talked about the Grand Pacific Hotel at Jackson and LaSalle at the time zones. My understanding is that was supposed to be the original location of Northwestern University, and that the university actually owned that land well into the 20th century.
The second part of that is true about owning the land. I don't know about the location of the university. Northwestern was started by businessmen from Chicago, so it's quite logical. And I know that they thought about a couple of sites down there. That might well be one of them, for a variety of reasons, in part because they wanted to protect the moral behavior of young men and women. They put it out here in the country, but yeah, that's an important location.
We have time for 1 more question. Here we go.
Thanks. I just want to say first that thank you very much. It's been a great evening. Glad that you would share it with us. My question is, now the places that burned in the Chicago fire, especially in the Loop, were, as you said, mostly frame buildings. There were probably buildings that had iron infrastructure, I guess is the name or the word, that melted in the flames. And so, of course, then the new buildings were constructed with steel, using steel. Does that have anything to do with Chicago being such a center for steel production?
That's a really good question. In fact, it's sort of several questions wrapped into one. The first buildings, the fire obliterated the Loop, and it melted iron, it disintegrated various kinds of stone and concrete. The first generation of buildings that were put up very quickly after the fire did not have steel frames. A lot of them had cast iron support. Some of them were masonry buildings of the old style. That skyscraper revolution I talked about, that didn't start until the 80s. So you got a kind of interim Chicago built between 1871 and the 1880s, which is not like that. But one of the kind of hallmarks of the 1880s is the introduction of structural steel for that kind of construction. And it helps to have a steelmaking industry right on your doorstep if you're going to build steel buildings. But by the time they're doing that, of course, there are several steelmaking centers. There's Detroit, there's Cleveland, there's Pittsburgh, and an elaborate network of movement of steel around the whole of the United States. So there are a lot of buildings in Chicago built with Chicago steel, but Chicago steel was not necessarily the reason why they were built. That makes sense?
Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you, Professor Binford. And we will be sharing this recording of this event to everyone that is registered. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.